At 4:30 in the morning, frost had already turned the grass between the tomato row silver. 14-year-old Mason Reed crouched beside the lowest section of his family's vegetable field, holding a flashlight in one hand and a thermometer in the other. The young tomato plants in the open control row looked stiff and grey. Ice crystals lined the edges of their leaves, and several growing tips had begun to darken. A few yards away, other plants stood inside tight circles of clear plastic jugs filled with water. Frost covered those jugs too. Their outer walls felt cold beneath Mason's fingers. But the thermometer placed inside one of the circles showed a slightly higher reading than the instrument in the unprotected row. The difference was small. By sunrise, Mason and his father would learn whether it had been large enough. If you enjoy quiet farm stories about simple ideas, honest failures, and people who notice what others overlook, subscribe and join us. Sometimes a harvest depends on preserving only a little more warmth than the night is able to take. 3 weeks earlier, the farm had felt almost like summer. Warm March afternoons had heated the soil in the sheltered valley below the Reed family's peach orchard. Daniel Reed decided to transplant a small batch of early tomatoes for the local market. If the plant survived, the family might have ripe fruit before most nearby growers. Mason began collecting empty plastic water and milk jugs from the house, the workshop, and neighboring farms. He washed each one, removed the labels, checked for cracks, and filled it with clean water. Then he placed several jugs in a close circle around every selected tomato plant. His older sister Claire stopped beside the rows and stared. "Are the tomatoes having a meeting?" Workers from a neighboring property pointed toward Mason and laughed. One said each plant had been given its own plastic army. Another asked whether the Reeds planned to sell water instead of vegetables. Mason kept a calm, thoughtful expression. He adjusted the distance between two jugs and checked that neither one touched the young stem. Daniel was not laughing. The full containers were heavy. They could interfere with weeding, fall onto the plants, or become scattered by wind. Filling and moving them also required time. Mason did not surround the entire field. He selected one experimental section, left several nearby plants completely unprotected, and placed thermometers at the same height in each group. He was not trying to heat the whole farm. He wanted to keep a small amount of daylight close to a few plants after the sun disappeared. The Reed family grew peaches as its main crop, but the vegetable field provided early produce for a weekend market in Yakima County. The first tomatoes of the season were valuable. Customers who had spent winter buying pale store fruit were willing to arrive early for tomatoes grown on a local farm. A few weeks of advantage could make the small vegetable patch worth the labor. That advantage also carried risk. Tomatoes could grow quickly during warm spring days, but their soft leaves and stems remained vulnerable to cold. A temperature that caused little damage to dormant trees could severely injure newly transplanted vegetables. Mason already understood that water could store heat. The previous spring, he had used large black barrels near young peach trees during a mild frost. The barrels absorbed energy during sunny hours and released part of it as the orchard cooled. They had not saved every blossom, but they had helped a small experimental section survive better than the lowest unprotected rows. The tomato field presented a different challenge. A barrel contained enough water to hold substantial warmth, but it was too large to place beside every plant. A plastic jug stored much less energy. Mason wondered whether several small containers positioned close together could create a useful pocket around one tomato. He tested the idea beside the workshop. Mason placed 2 identical potted seedlings in the sun. He left the first one open. Around the second, he arranged a tight circle of water-filled jugs. Thermometers rested beside both stems. During the afternoon, the exposed soil warmed quickly. The water inside the jugs changed temperature more slowly. After sunset, the pattern reversed. The open pot cooled faster. The thermometer inside the ring of jugs remained slightly higher for part of the night. The difference nearly disappeared after a cloudy day. That result mattered as much as the successful test. The jugs did not produce heat. They could release only what the water had absorbed earlier. Strong wind could carry that warmth away, and severe cold could overwhelm it. Mason created 3 groups in the field. The first had no protection. The second had a few jugs placed loosely around each plant. The third had full circles with smaller gaps between the containers. He also measured the spaces between the jugs. A circle that was too open allowed cold air to pass through easily. A circle that was too tight could block access, shade the soil, or press against the leaves. Daniel watched Mason move the containers by inches. "You know we have proper row cover in the shed," he said. "Not enough for every row. And the jugs will not be as reliable." "I know." That answer surprised Daniel. Mason was not trying to prove that plastic containers were better than professional protection. He was testing whether a cheap method could help when better materials were limited. The first arrangement nearly destroyed several plants before cold weather had a chance to reach them. Mason placed the jugs too close to the stems. During a windy afternoon, one full container leaned inward and snapped a young side branch. Another pressed against several leaves, trapping moisture between the plastic and the plant. 2 old milk jugs developed slow leaks. By the next morning, they were almost empty. Water had softened the soil beneath them, causing the containers to tilt. One slid toward a tomato and bent the supporting stake. Several caps did not fit properly. Dirt and insects entered the openings. A half-empty jug became light enough for the wind to roll it between the rows. The loose group performed poorly for another reason. The spaces between the containers were so wide that they offered little shelter. They looked like a system without behaving like one. Daniel inspected the damage. "The plants need protection from the weather," he said, "not from your protection." Mason knew the criticism was fair. He removed every damaged jug and tested the remaining ones for leaks before returning them to the field. He filled them in the morning and left them on dry boards for several hours. Any dark patch beneath a container meant it was rejected. He pressed the bases slightly into the soil to improve stability, but kept most of each jug above ground where sunlight could reach the water. He increased the distance from the stems and left a removable container in every circle so the soil could still be watered and inspected. Where the ground sloped sharply, he abandoned the idea. A full jug falling downhill could crush a plant. Claire helped him gather stronger containers with matching caps. She still called them Mason's tomato guards, but she stopped placing empty bottles beside the rows as a joke. After another cool night, the results became clearer. The loosely spaced jugs offered inconsistent protection. Some plants recorded temperatures similar to the control group. The tight circles cooled more slowly. The advantage remained modest, and by morning nearly all the groups had become cold. But the full rings held their small difference longer. Mason marked the best arrangement with wooden stakes. The workers across the road still pointed and laughed when they passed. Mason did not respond. The experiment had already taught him that a strange idea was not useful merely because it looked clever. The jugs had to remain upright, full, close enough to work together, and far enough away to avoid harming the plant. Every container now had a purpose. Then the weather forecast changed. The warning arrived after several warm days. A mass of cold, dry air was expected to enter the valley. The afternoon would remain sunny, but the sky would clear after sunset and the wind would weaken. Cold air would settle into the lowest parts of the farm before dawn. Daniel had feared that possibility from the moment he transplanted the tomatoes. The family owned some row cover, but not enough to protect the entire vegetable field. They used it on the youngest and most valuable rows. The experimental plants remained uncovered so Mason could test the water circles honestly. Before sunset, he inspected every jug. He replaced one leaking container, tightened the caps, filled the low ones, and cleared dry leaves from around the bases. Thermometers went inside the tight circles, beside the loose groups, and among the control plants. The water had spent the day in direct sun. As evening began, the readings were nearly identical. After dark, the open rows cooled first. By midnight, the grass at the edge of the field began to sparkle beneath Mason's flashlight. The sky was clear, the air was still, and the lowest ground felt noticeably colder. The scattered jugs produced uneven results. Some stood too far apart to keep their stored warmth near the plants. The tight circles performed better. The plastic walls were not hot. The water did not create a warm greenhouse. Yet the containers remained slightly warmer than the surrounding air and released energy gradually around the leaves and stems. Not every circle succeeded. One plant stood in a low depression where cold air collected. Its outer leaves began stiffening despite the water. Another circle contained a jug with a hidden crack. The weakened container had lost much of its water and contributed little. The coldest period arrived shortly before sunrise. Daniel joined Mason in the field. Together they moved between the rows, recording temperatures and touching the rigid leaves. The control plants looked worst. The loose group showed mixed damage. Inside the best circles, some leaves remained softer and greener, though frost still covered the exposed outer edges. Daniel studied the instruments. "Do you think it was enough?" Mason looked toward the pale eastern sky. "We will know after they thaw." A thermometer could show that one place had been slightly warmer. It could not promise that living tissue had survived. Sunlight reached the vegetable field slowly. At first, every plant looked similar. Frost melted from the leaves, and clear drops gathered along the veins. Then the damaged tissue began to reveal itself. Several control plants collapsed. Their leaves darkened, softened, and hung beside the stems. Some retained living growth near the base and might recover, but the worst plants would have to be replaced. The loosely arranged jugs produced mixed results. A few tomatoes remained healthy. Others suffered almost as much damage as the open controls. The tight water circles showed the clearest difference. They had not kept every leaf untouched. Outer foliage on several plants turned dark. One tomato in the cold depression lost nearly its entire top. The plant beside the leaking jug performed no better than the unprotected row. But most tomatoes surrounded by full, stable circles still had firm green stems and living growing points. Over the next several days, the comparison became stronger. Some control plants recovered slowly. Others were replaced with younger seedlings from the greenhouse. The surviving plants inside the best water circles resumed growth sooner. That advantage did not create an enormous harvest. A later heat spell damaged flowers. Several tomatoes developed cracks after irregular rain. The plants still required staking, watering, pruning, and protection from disease. But the earlier survivors flowered first and produced marketable fruit before the replacement plants caught up. The neighbor who had joked about plastic armies stopped beside the field during early harvest. He compared the larger plants inside the remaining circles with the younger tomatoes in the replanted control row. "How many jugs did you use around each one?" he asked. Mason did not mention the laughter. He led the man to the plant in the cold depression. Its stem had survived, but the top remained stunted. "This one had the same circle," Mason said. "It was simply in the wrong place." He explained the limits. The method worked best after a sunny day, on level ground, during a weak and still frost. It could not replace proper covers. It required sound containers, tight spacing, and regular inspection. Strong wind or deeper cold could remove the small advantage completely. The following spring, the reeds did not surround every tomato. They used the jugs only around a small group of the earliest plants and covered the rest with more reliable material whenever enough was available. From the road, the selected rows once again looked as though each tomato plant sat inside a gathering of clear plastic bottles. This time, Daniel helped arrange them. Mason had not stopped winter from returning. He had simply kept part of one warm afternoon inside water long enough for several young plants to reach morning.